Well, good afternoon after lunch. So I've got to tell you, as convicted as I am about that last conversation we had about bivocovo and how I really do think it's not just about the future of the church, it's about the present of the church. And we need to think along those lines. But as crucial, as important as that conversation is, I have to tell you what we're about to talk about is actually my greatest passion. As passionate as I am about bivocovo, what we're going to talk about next really is just like if I did something else, like if I could have another career at this point, it's a little late for me, but if I did, I'd probably be an urban planner. Seriously, I am just fascinated by how we live and where we live. And all of this kind of started probably about 20 years ago, maybe close to 25 years ago. I was reading a book that was published actually 30 years ago by a sociologist. His name is Ray Oldenburg, and he wrote a book called The Great Good Place. Now let's see if we have the slides up here, Jacob. So here's a picture of the book. I'm not really, unless you're into sociology, I'm not like highly recommending you go read this book. But it was fascinating to me because here's the premise of the book, and then I'm going to tell you why I'm bringing this book up, because there was actually a sentence in this book that I read 25 years ago that when I read that sentence, I thought, oh my goodness, that would be a great way to frame what it looks like to live out a missionary lifestyle. Like this one sentence just gave me a framework for what I would call missionality. Like, how do we think and live out a missionary lifestyle? But let me tell you just a little bit about the book and the reason why it kind of captured my attention. So Oldenburg in the book was arguing 25 years ago, well, actually it was written 30 years ago. He was arguing 30 years ago that we have sucked the relational vitality out of the neighborhoods in which we live. And he said we did that primarily through three kind of forces. The first force is what he called the rise of the suburbs. So in other words, people that lived in the city, usually in close proximity, left the city to move out into the suburbs. The second was what he called the rise of the automobile culture, where we would get in our automobiles, almost always by ourselves, to drive out of our neighborhoods to do life. So in other words, we would get in our cars and we'd drive out of where we live to go to school, to go to work, to get a haircut, to buy groceries, to go to church, because all of those things were zoned out of the suburbs. And then the third force he called the rise of the entertainment culture, which was kind of funny when you think about it, because 30 years ago it was just television. So now think about all the screens that we have and all the other things that like capture our attention. So I just found that fascinating that, you know, the way he thought about not only where we lived, but the implications of how we lived in those places. So I want to share with you just one quote. Oh, let me tell you the subtitle of the book. So the book is called The Great Good Place. I always have to read the subtitle because I think it's the longest subtitle in book history. Okay, here it is. So it's called The Great Good Place. Let me catch my breath because here's the subtitle. Cafes, coffee shops, community centers, beauty parlors, general stores, bars, hangouts, and how they get you through the day. I love that. But here's a quote from the book that kind of summarizes the theme, and then this quote, this isn't the sentence, but this is a quote that really influenced the way I started thinking about where we live as a family and how we live in that place. So here's the quote. He says, "The problem of place in America manifests itself in a sorely deficient informal public life." Now let's pause there for a minute. Just that little phrase. We need informal public life. He goes on to say, American lifestyles, for all the material acquisition and the seeking after comforts and pleasures, are plagued, this was 30 years ago, are plagued by boredom, loneliness, alienation, and a very high price tag. Now let's pause there for a minute. If we had time, I'd love to share all of this research and the studies that have taken place in the last 2 decades, over and over and over again, of showing that when we live like this, it kills us. And that's what he means by a very high price tag. It kills us emotionally, it kills us spiritually, it even is killing us physically, because we are disconnected. The level of alienation and loneliness and isolation in our neighborhoods is just at an all-time high. And COVID, of course, has accelerated that to a way that we don't even fully understand. Then this quote ends, America can point to many areas where she has made progress, but in the area of informal public life, she has lost ground and continues to lose it. Fascinating. 30 years ago, and I think this is more true today than ever before. So the little phrase, though, or the sentence is in the book. He talks about what he coins this phrase, our first, second, and third places. And some of you are probably familiar with this, but again, when I first saw this statement, I thought, man, what a great way to kind of frame what it would look like to think and act like a missionary. So here's the way Oldenburg describes the first, second, and third place. First place is where you live. It's your home. Second place is where you work. And third place are these places of neutrality or common ground where people used to go to hang out. And those are the things listed in that subtitle. Well, this afternoon, for the sake of time, I want to focus on first place and third place. Because second place, we've talked a little bit about vocation, a little bit about workplace. But I just think there is so much to unpack about thinking, how do we live out a missionary lifestyle in our first place, our neighborhood, and then one of the most opportunistic opportunities I think we have to live like a missionary is in these places he calls third places. I think we actually need to identify these third places, and then we need to incarnate into those places because they create relational opportunities that I don't think we can have anywhere else, and I'll explain that here in just a minute. So when it comes to first place, in my mind, when I think about thinking like a missionary, it actually involves two things. Now, Oldenburg just kind of talked about our home and where we live, but for me, it involves two things. It involves neighboring, and it involves what I call biblical hospitality. Now, the whole neighboring thing, again, if you're interested in this, I wish I had a free ebook that you could just go download, but I don't with this one. But about probably 4 years ago, a friend of mine, I wrote a book called Next Door as It Is in Heaven. And this book is just about neighboring. It's just about what does it look like to re-neighbor our neighborhoods. And we could spend a whole day just talking about that. But I just want to share with you one little exercise that we have in the book that is actually taken from another book on neighboring that I love. A good friend of mine named Dave Runyon is a book called The Art of Neighboring. And some of you are probably familiar with that book. But there's a little exercise in that book that we also shared in this one that anytime we do a seminar on neighboring, it's always a great place to start. So I just want to share this with you because this might be something you want to do in your own congregation. So I have no idea what those slides are. There we go. All right. So here's what I normally do. If I can make photocopies, I'll make photocopies of this and hand it out to everybody. If not, I'll ask everybody, we don't have time to do this, but I want you to do this mentally, okay? I'll ask everybody to take out a piece of paper and draw a tic-tac-toe, okay? And then once they kind of do that, I'll say, okay, now here's what I want you to do. I want you to visualize that middle box is your house. That's where you live. And then I'll let everybody kind of take a moment and kind of do that. And then I'll say, okay, now here's what I want you to do next. I want you to write the names of everybody that live in the 8 houses around you. And there's almost always, they're either crickets or you can actually hear groans, like, ooh. Because most of the time, especially Christians, we don't know the names of our neighbors. And a lot of times, jokingly, I'll say, now, you have to put real names. You can't put, like, the guy that smokes a cigarette out on his balcony. Or, the lady that walks her dog. No, they have to be real names. And then if we want to get, really bad, we'll say, okay, now we want you to write something personal about that person in that box under their name. Well, the point of this whole exercise when we talk about re-neighboring our neighborhoods is we can't love our neighbors if we don't know their names. So it has to start there. But there's so many other just wonderful things you can do. I just think we have to, again, who better than us as followers of Jesus to re-neighbor our neighborhoods? I mean, we know that we are created as social relational beings. God has created us to be in a relationship with Him and be in relationships with other people. So who better than us to break those bonds of isolation and loneliness and alienation? So I think the best place to do that, to start, is in our neighborhoods. I mean, they're up and down whatever street you live, there is no doubt there are people in those homes that are extremely lonely and isolated. So who better than us to reach into that? So if you're interested in that, I'd recommend The Art of Neighboring by Dave Runyon, or check out Next Door as It Is in Heaven. So What I really want to do, though, is move from neighboring to the second part of first place, which is about biblical hospitality. I just think this is one of the most powerful themes in Scripture that we have to recapture. It's kind of like the missionary nature of the church. This is something I think that we've lost, and we have to recapture. I just think this is almost like at the foundation of us living out a missionary lifestyle, especially in our neighborhoods. Now, you'll notice I put the word biblical in front of the word hospitality, and I always do that to try to differentiate biblical hospitality from what most people think of when they hear the word hospitality. Now, I think when most people hear the word hospitality, especially in an American context, we think of entertaining. We think about having, friends and family over to the house. And there's nothing wrong with having friends and family over to the house, but that's not true biblical hospitality. I remember years ago someone shared this with me. This is a good place to start, but this doesn't go far enough to understanding biblical hospitality. But I remember years ago someone saying the difference between entertaining and hospitality is that entertaining actually puts the emphasis on you as the host. So think about that for a moment. When we entertain and you have someone over to your house, what do you do before they come over? You clean, right? Now, I'm not saying don't clean, but think about it for a minute. Why do we do that? Yeah, most of the time we do it because we're concerned about the reflection our house has on us. See, when we entertain, it kind of puts the emphasis on us, but biblical hospitality actually puts the emphasis on our guest. So again, I think that's a good place to start, but that doesn't go far enough. True biblical hospitality is a powerful theme throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. So very briefly, in the Old Testament, for the most part, biblical hospitality is about how the nation of Israel cared for or treated the vulnerable. So listen to Leviticus 19:33 and 34. It says, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The stranger, and hang on to that word there, stranger for a minute, residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself. That in the Hebrew, it literally means they're just like you. Okay? For you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. I love, Tim Keller has a wonderful little book called Generous Justice. And in that book, he talks a bit about Old Testament biblical hospitality. And I love, he has this little phrase, he calls it the quartet of the vulnerable. And the quartet of the vulnerable are the poor, the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner. So in the Old Testament, for the most part, hospitality was how the nation of Israel treated or cared for the poor, the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner. But then when you move into the New Testament, for me, it's even more fascinating. In the New Testament, the word that we actually translate hospitality is the word philoxenia. So get this, philoxenia, it's a combination of two words. It's the word phileo for love, and it's the word xenos for stranger. So every time you see the word hospitality in the New Testament, it literally means love the stranger, or love of stranger. Now, it's a little embarrassing. I'm not going to show it to you because it's a little embarrassing. But the only tattoo I have that I got on my 59th birthday, which has been a while, but I got philoxenia on my arm because it's a great reminder to me that I need to love the stranger, but it's been a fantastic, especially in Florida because you always wear t-shirts, that it's just a great conversation starter. People go like, now what's that word on your arm? Is that Greek? Is that Latin? And then I get the opportunity to say, no, it's actually this word in the New Testament called philoxenia. We translate it hospitality, but it really means love of stranger. And really, people, it's like, wow, love of stranger. It just opens up all kinds of wonderful opportunities for conversation. But get that, the power of that, love of stranger, that certainly doesn't sound like entertaining, right? I mean, so think, biblical hospitality, we are to love the stranger. So lots of different passages in the New Testament with the word hospitality. The word hospitality isn't used in this passage, but this is one of my favorite passages where Jesus kind of pushes the envelope on the way we ought to understand biblical hospitality. This is a passage you've probably read dozens and dozens of times, but I hope you hear something as we read it this time afresh. There's something here that maybe you've never really noticed or heard before. So this is Luke chapter 14, verses 12, 13, and 14. So Jesus says, when you give a dinner or a banquet, Do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors. Now, that's always kind of funny to me. Don't invite your rich neighbors. But he says, when you give a dinner or banquet, don't invite these people, which is kind of odd, but listen to what else he says. Lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. Now, we do that all the time, don't we? I mean, when we entertain, you have people over your house. When they get ready to walk out the door, a lot of times, what do they say to you? Yeah, next time, our place, right? It's like, no, don't invite them because they'll feel obligated that they have to repay you. Like, they'll have to invite you to their house next time. So then Jesus goes on to say, but when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and here's the key, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. So see, not only is true biblical hospitality the love of stranger, but it's extending it to those that cannot reciprocate. It's extending it to those that are in no position to pay you back. That's pretty strong, isn't it? So when we think of hospitality, see why we need to recapture hospitality, not think about entertaining, but it actually involves us giving of our lives. In many cases, it's sacrificing, it's extending it to the stranger, and it's providing it to those that are in no position to reciprocate. So a few other passages in the New Testament: rejoice in hope, be patient in suffering, persevere in prayer, contribute to the needs of the saints, extend hospitality to strangers. So John Stott's commentary on Romans, he actually says a better rendering of the word extend is pursue. So he's saying, no, Paul is actually saying you need to be out on the streets pursuing opportunities to extend love to strangers. That's pretty crazy. Hebrews 13, do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for so by doing, some people have shown hospitality to angels without even knowing it. I remember the first time I ever read that verse, it kind of freaked me out. 1 Timothy 3:2, the overseer is to be above reproach, faithful to his wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach. It's interesting how we like to focus on other little phrases in that, but how often have you said, no, a leader needs to be radically hospitable? We don't normally focus on that. And then 1 Peter, offer hospitality to anyone without grumbling. So here's what I like about hospitality. It is about making physical space and welcoming people into physical space, but I would say it's actually about a posture. It's about a perspective that we have about relationships with other people. So I say making space for hospitality is not only about creating physical environments that are welcoming to others. It is that, but it's more than that. It's also about the posture we take towards human relationships in general. So I would say, really, if you could boil biblical hospitality all down to one word, and some Christians are uncomfortable with this word, but I don't think we should be, it's the word inclusion. We should be radically inclusive. Jesus was radically inclusive. But unfortunately, the world often sees us the exact opposite, right? I mean, if the world was to describe us, unfortunately, often they use the word exclusive. Like we exclude people from what we're doing or who we are, but we ought to be radically inclusive. So biblical hospitality. So there we go. So just to kind of wrap up this part of the first, and then I want to focus on third places. I think it's really helpful for us to take just a few moments and ask, why don't we do this? I mean, if there's this strong, powerful theme throughout Scripture that we ought to be hospitable, and Jesus was radically hospitable, and we ought to be radically hospitable. Why don't we do this? Well, I bet if I asked you, you would shout out the two greatest reasons why we don't do this. Let's try it. Like, share one reason that we are not radically hospitable. What do you think? Fear is yes, I would say that's the second one we're going to talk about. What's the first one? Too busy. That's right. See, you guys are so smart. Really, there's just no doubt. I think those are the two greatest barriers for us being hospitable. If you ask people this, I mean, they'll just say, I'm just too busy. Or you might say, you're just too busy. So I think to overcome that, because we have to learn how to be more hospitable. So let's talk a little bit about how can we overcome our busyness and how can we perhaps overcome fear. So again, it's another book, I know. But another book, and I'll bet, no doubt, some of you have read this book. This book's been around probably for close to 30 years as well, but it's called Margin. It's written by a Christian psychiatrist by the name of Richard Swenson. I love this book. I read it probably 20 years ago. Still, every single week, I'm reminded of this book. So here's what the book is really about. It's a beautiful metaphor. He uses the language of margin. So he says you can take a book, any book, and it doesn't matter how many pages, how big the book is. You can open to any page in any book, and you're going to find a white space that goes around the top of the page, the sides of the page, and the bottom of the page. That white space is called a margin. Well, he said if you opened a book and the ink went all the way to the edge or all the way to the top and there was no margin, you'd probably hate the publisher. But every single book has a margin. Well, he uses that as a metaphor to say our lives have to have margin. We need to have financial margin. We need to have relational margin. We need to have time margin. So in other words, we can't have every minute of every day completely full on our schedule. So, for example, like you have no margin in your life. If you're 10 minutes late to one meeting and it makes you 30 minutes late to the next meeting and then you're an hour and a half late to the next meeting, it means you have no margin. Remember that little phrase when we were talking about language yesterday? It probably didn't make sense, but one of the phrases on language, it says relationships happen in the margins. So in other words, when we have no margin, when we're so busy, like you get home from work and you see your neighbor next door and he's taking his trash down at the end of the sidewalk and you think, man, I'd love to go over and see Bob, but I got that church meeting I got to be at in 10 minutes and I need to go in and change my shirt. You have no margin. See, it's in the margin, I would argue, where God can spontaneously interrupt us relationally in our neighborhoods. So we have to figure out how to create margins. So just a couple things that Swinson says. He says, without margin, we're incapable of relational spontaneity in our neighborhood. Without margin, we are uninterested in opportunities to serve our neighbors. Because think, if you're just so busy, you don't even think about it. And even if it comes up, you think, yeah, I can't really go over and serve my neighbor because I just don't have time. Without margin, we're unable to even think about planning time to spend with others. Yeah, I'm going to just have to have you do that, Jacob, sorry. So margin creates buffers. It gives us room to breathe, freedom to act, and time to adapt. Only then will we be able to truly nourish our relationships. Only then will we be available and interruptible for the purposes of God. So I hope you're convinced, just very shortly there, very briefly, that if you don't have any margin in your life, you've got to figure out how to create margin. So in the book, Next Door as It Is in Heaven, I just share 3 super simple A words that help to do this. First off, it's kind of like what we talked about with language yesterday. I think you need to do a margin audit. Just open up your calendar. My wife and I, we do this. We don't do it as often as we used to, but on Sunday nights, we would open up calendars. We'd talk about the week that's coming ahead, and we'd ask ourselves, do we have margin in our lives? Is there margin throughout the week to spend time in our neighborhood? So do an audit. The second thing is alignment. What I mean by this is when you think about engaging in missionary behaviors and activities, think about alignment, not addition. Because sometimes when we talk about all the stuff we've been talking about in the last several sessions, it can be a little overwhelming. You might think like, oh great, now I've got to have a meal with my lost neighbor. You might be thinking about, well, I've got to add more stuff to my life. But I'm telling you, it's not about addition, it's about aligning. It's about aligning the rhythms of our lives with the rhythms of the lives of other people. So the things you're already doing, if you're going to watch the football game, invite your neighbor over to watch the game with you. Most of us eat 21 meals a week. I know some eat more than that. But you're going to have 3 meals a day. What if you invite somebody into one of those meals? And a lot of times when I talk about meals, I'll even say, don't define sharing a meal too narrowly. I think the single best thing we can do is share a full-blown meal around the table in our home, but maybe it means lunch. Maybe it means coffee. Maybe it means taking someone to lunch at work. Maybe it means telling someone you're going to meet them for coffee before work. So just the things you're already doing, ask yourself, how can I align the rhythms that I'm already engaged in with the rhythms of the lives of other people? And the last one, accountability, is pretty straightforward. Just have someone ask you the tough questions about margin. Have someone ask you, do you have margin in your week this week? And if not, how are you going to create margin? Okay? So I hope you believe we need to be radically hospitable. I just think it's a huge, enormous part of living out a missionary lifestyle. And one of the great barriers is we're just too busy. We cannot add hospitality to an already overburdened life. We have to figure out what's important. We have to let some things go, and we have to create margin. But the second one is fear. So just to do this really quick, I just want to share with you a quote. I won't name, it's another book, sorry. But there's a book that also written a few years ago by Alan and Deb Hirsch. And Deb, they wrote it together, and the book was called Untamed. And in one of the chapters that Deb wrote, the chapter was called Refocusing on the Family. So it was a little play on words. And in it, she makes a statement about how we sometimes, as evangelical Christians, strive after safety and security in such a way that it's disastrous for us living a missionary lifestyle. Now, I'll tell you, this might step on some toes, this quote that I'm going to read here in a minute. But just remember, this is Deb, not Brad, okay? I didn't say this, I'm just reading, okay? So the other thing I'd say is there was a day this would have crushed my toes, okay? So if this steps on your toes a little bit, just know I was there with you. I hope I'm not there every day now, all the time, although there are some days I feel very selfish. It's like, no, I don't want to go outside and do that. But I think as a family, I think we're better at that than we've ever been. So this is kind of an extended quote. It's over 3 slides, but just be open and just listen, okay? So Deb writes, she's talking about our homes, okay? She says, this is our space, and those we may invite into that space are carefully chosen based on whether we will upset the delicate status quo, inconvenience us, or pose a threat to our perceived safety. In other words, visitors, especially strange ones, stress us out. And while this is in some sense culturally understandable, the negative result in terms of our spirituality is that the family has effectively become a pernicious idol. Now that's pretty strong. I mean, pernicious means wicked, that we've actually turned our understanding of the family into an idol. Culture has once again trumped our social responsibility. In such a situation, she calls it missional hospitality, is seen as a threat, not as an opportunity to extend the kingdom. So an idol is born. Last slide. It's not hard to see how this is absolutely disastrous from a missional perspective. I love these last 2 lines. Our families and our homes should be places where people can experience a foretaste of heaven, where the church is rightly viewed as a community of the redeemed from all walks of life. But instead, our fears restrict us from letting go of the control and safety we have spent years cultivating. Remember, this is Deb, not Brad, right? But it's pretty powerful, isn't it? I mean, I just think it's hard to argue that we have kind of accepted this perspective that our homes are our refuge, and we're constantly seeking after safety and security. You know, we have, like 5-foot privacy fences weren't high enough, so we have 10-foot privacy fences. And, we used to have big front porches, and now we have little tiny front porches and great big decks in the back behind the privacy fences. We have garage door openers so we can get in quick and get that thing shut. So again, who better than us? I mean, as followers of Jesus, we shouldn't be controlled by fear, and certainly not fear of the stranger. So I just think when you think about being radically hospitable, ask yourself, do I have margin for God to spontaneously interrupt me? And am I allowing my fear of the stranger to keep me from being radically hospitable? So first place is where we live. It's about re-neighboring our neighborhoods. It's about biblical hospitality. And then what I love this line. This is from a book called Radical Hospitality. Just to wrap up what Deb's quote, it says, the question is not how dangerous is that stranger. The real question is how dangerous will I become if I'm not more open? Okay, so back to third places. So in the book, it's interesting, Oldenburg is a real stickler about defining a third place. So remember, he's a sociologist. I don't think he was a believer, but I mean, you can be a sociologist and a believer. I'm just not sure that he was. But But he's a real stickler. Like whenever he talks about these third places, these places of neutrality or common ground where people used to go and hang out, he is such a stickler that in his book, he has these 8 characteristics that where he defines what a third place is. And he actually says in the book, if you have a place in your neighborhood and if you can't check all 8 of these boxes, it's not really a third place. Well, I think that goes a little too far. But to fully understand what he means by a third place, we're not going to read all of this, but I just want to show you what these 8 characteristics are, and then let's talk about what should we do with this. So go to the next slide. So here's the first 4. So he says a true typical third place, first off, it's neutral ground. So people are free to come and go, okay? You don't like need a membership, or it's kind of like open to anyone. It acts as a leveler. Now I think this is really fascinating. It acts as a leveler. So in other words, no matter what your social location is, no matter your education or what part of town you live in or how much money you make, when you go into a true third place, everybody's on the same level playing field, okay? Conversation is the main activity. So in other words, going to a football game, that's not a third place, because the main activity in a true third place is conversation. People are there to know others and be known by others. Accessible and accommodating. So he says the best third placers are those to which one may go to at almost any time of the day or evening. Like, they're very accessible. They're always easy to get to. It's like, it's not hidden. It's like everybody knows where it is, okay? So Jacob, next slide. He says there are regulars. So in other words, a typical third place, people go there so often that the same people go there. So like if you go there at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it's a good bet you're going to see these 3 or 4 people. Low profile, it just means it's not fancy. A lot of times we'll call a true third place like a hole in the wall. You know, have you ever said that? It's like, yeah, the place is kind of a hole in the wall. Like we have a Mexican restaurant in our neighborhood called VIP. It's a hole in the wall. It's the best Mexican food I've ever had. And I'm always saying that to people. No. Go. I know it looks horrible, but you got to go and you got to try it. The mood is playful. So there's just games. People are happy to be there. They like to be there and having conversations with others. And the last one's a home away from home. So in other words, if someone isn't in their home, this is where they want to be. Now, if you're as old as I am, and you think about television, what's coming to mind right now? Yeah, of course, Cheers, right? So, right. I mean, it's really fun if we had the time to think about Cheers and go through all 8 of those characteristics, because every one of them is there. Like that's just one example, is acts as a leveler. So remember in Cheers, you've got the psychiatrist and the mailman sitting at the bar having a beer together. See, it doesn't matter where they come from, it acts as a leveler. Well, what's fascinating, though, is that doing research for the next door as it is in heaven, there's a chapter in here that I wrote on third places, and I went back and just kind of like studied all the sitcoms over really probably the past 25 or 30 years. And every single one of them has some sort of third place, like in the setting of that sitcom. So this next slide's kind of silly, but, you know, it might be hard to see. But, I mean, many of you know what you're looking at here, right? I mean, remember Mayberry RFD? It was Floyd's Barbershop. You've got Arnold's with Happy Days. In the middle is Central Perk, right, with Friends, right? Yeah, that one's kind of dark down there, but it's Seinfeld. It's either Tom's Restaurant or Monk's Cafe. And then there's a sitcom called How I Met Your Mother, and it's McLaren's Pub. And then jokingly, I'll say even SpongeBob had the Krusty Krab. So, see, they all do. Every one of them has a third place. So, I'm sorry, Jacob, go ahead, go to the next. So, here's what I want you to get, though, when we're thinking about third places, is I want you to think about what are these typical third places, and then I think we need to, like, crack open our imagination and think of third places that wouldn't necessarily fit Oldenburg's definition, but they're third places that we need to engage in. So, when you think of typical third places, really all you have to do is just go to his subtitle. Cafes, coffee shops, pubs, general stores, beauty parlors, barbershops. It's those sorts of establishments in your neighborhood that fit those 8 characteristics, okay? So those are typical third places. But then there are what I call atypical third places. So these are any place that you frequent on an ongoing basis. Again, they wouldn't check all 8 of the boxes, but for me, they check enough of the boxes that we ought to think of these as missionary opportunities. So things like the library, the gym, the laundromat, a farmer's market, a community garden, parks, grocery stores, shopping malls. It's any place you go to on an ongoing basis. You just got to go there with intentionality, and that will actually become an atypical third place. And then in my mind, there's almost kind of a third category. I just call them temporary third places. So these are places that aren't around all the time. Like now, where I live, the community swimming pool is open all the time. But when we were in Kansas City, it wasn't. So I said a community swimming pool. And I still remember when we lived in Kansas City, when this hit me, is I remember going to the swimming pool one day, and our youngest daughter, Chloe, was swimming, and I just noticed all the parents that were sitting around the swimming pool keep an eye on their kid, and then they were making connections with each other. It's like, no, wait, now which house do you live in, and which kid belongs to you? And I thought, this is like a temporary third place if we step into that place with intentionality. So swimming pools, garage sales, I was telling you about in Kansas City, we did a fire pit. So when we would do that fire pit, I viewed that as an atypical or temporary third place. So we were actually creating a space for people to connect with relationally. So the main thing I wanted to get to, though, is this. What do we do with that? What do we do with these third places? So I think there's two big things we need to do with it. As we think like missionaries, two things we need to do with typical, atypical, and temporary third places. First off, we have to identify them. So once again, if we had time, another little exercise we'll do sometimes is have everybody map their neighborhood. So I'll actually give an example or a picture of what it looks like to map your neighborhood, and then we'll give everybody some time to actually draw a map of their neighborhood, where their house is, and all these other stores and shops and locations that we put on a slide to say, okay, now where are all these? Well, in that exercise, we want them to identify the typical, atypical, and temporary third places. So the first thing we have to do is identify. But then the second thing we have to do with those, to go back to the very first session when we talked about incarnational presence, is that we have to incarnate into those third places. In other words, we need to become a regular in those places. And there's three words I like to talk about as it relates to that. Like, what does it look like for us to become a regular? And I know you can't become a regular in all of those third places, but you need to pick one. Kind of say like, and I even say to people, look, if you have like 3 coffee shops you like to go to, pick one and go to that one all the time. And then also, you can't use the drive-thru and it'd be a third place, okay? You actually have to park your car and go inside, okay? You can't, so just from this moment on, give up drive-thrus, okay? You can't use them anymore, okay? I hate drive-thrus. My kids know that. It's like, oh no, Daddy, we're going to go to the drive-thru. But we have to incarnate. You can't incarnate into a third place in the drive-thru, okay? You've got to go inside. But pick one of those places and begin to become a regular in that place. And then when you do, the things you need to do is, first off, you need to observe. You need to become the greatest observer you've ever been. In other words, pay attention to what's going on around you. Remember, participate in the Missio Dei. You have to discover, what is God doing? Listen to the conversations that other people are having. Get to know the people that work there. Go through this same checkout line, whatever it takes to observe and pay attention to what is God doing in the lives of people that work there, but also the other regulars that are there. And part of that is listening. We have to become great listeners. We have to stop moving into places and thinking we're the only ones that have something to say. We need to listen to the people that are there. And then the last word is frequency. So here's what I mean by this. I just think third place, as important as it is to be a good neighbor, and as important as it is to re-neighbor our neighborhoods, I think third places give us an opportunity, a relational opportunity that we have nowhere else. Here's a kind of a silly way I like to explain this. Is I like to say, if you went to your next door neighbor's house every single morning and knocked on their door to say good morning, what would they think of you? It's strange, right? They think you're crazy. They might call you a stalker, right? But if you go to your favorite third place every single day, what do they think of you? That's right. You're a regular. You're a great customer, right? So see, I'm telling you, in third places, there's an opportunity to ramp up. There's like a frequency in a much shorter period of time. You can get to know people in a third place, where typically in our neighborhoods, it might take months to really get to know your neighbor, because we don't see our next door neighbor every single day. And the only way we really get to know them is we have to spend time with them, invite them over to things and all that. But there's just something special about third places. It just opens up relational opportunities that we don't have anywhere else. And then the last thing, not only do we need to identify and incarnate, but in some cases, I think we actually need to become place makers. So in other words, individually and as a church, We need to look at our facilities, we need to look at our spaces, and we need to ask, what can I do to actually create an environment where a type of third place can flourish? And again, that's what we did with the fire pit. In the sense of a fire pit, in a really simple way, we became a placemaker. We created this place where people could gather together. And I think we could do that as churches. Like I said, we need to look at our facilities and we need to say, do we have space outside we can put up a basketball goal or a volleyball net or whatever it is? Pay attention to what does the community need? What kind of activity is the community dying for, and can you and your church facility provide that? So, Crystal, I'm going to have Crystal come up and just share. We've got just a few minutes, and I'll just say, let's do this around the table, and then I think at the beginning of the next session, we might try to debrief this just a little bit, okay?
All right, thank you, Brad. Can we give him a round of applause for this one? I know I have taken a lot of notes, so